Good evening and welcome to the New Haven Museum's webinar tonight. My name is Cynthia Riccio and I am the Director of Programs and Planning for the museum. I am excited for tonight's program, which is the inaugural event of New Haven 250, an ongoing series of programming developed by the New Haven Museum to complement America 250. Culminating with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the series will highlight inclusive, local, and lesser-known stories connecting past and present. So tonight, from military heroism to infamy, Benedict Arnold's name has become synonymous with treasonous behavior. Tonight, basing the presentation on his new book, God Save Benedict Arnold, The True Story of America's Most Hated Man. Author Jack Kelly will offer an exploration of the triumphs, flaws, and motivations of Arnold. He will also offer a reevaluation of Arnold's career, show his string of heroic achievements, and speculate on what may have prompted Arnold's betrayal. Jack Kelly is an award-winning author and historian. His books include Band of Giants, the amateur soldiers who won America's independence, which received the DAR History Medal. He is also the author of Valcourt, The Edge of Anarchy, Heaven's Ditch, and Gunpowder. He has published 5 novels and is a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow in nonfiction literature. Kelly has appeared on the History Channel, National Public Radio, and C-SPAN. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Cindy, and I want to thank you and all the folks at the museum and everybody that's tuning in tonight. Okay. So I wrote the book, God Save Benedict Arnold, because everybody knows Benedict Arnold, and almost everybody just knows one thing about him. And I don't even have to say what that thing is because you know what it is. But I wanted to get across the idea that there's a lot more to Benedict Arnold than that one thing, and that it's really important to understand Arnold in order to get a good, clear picture of the Revolutionary War. I also felt, and Cindy mentioned the 250th anniversary of the revolutions that's coming up, really starting next year, and Benedict Arnold's career really makes a good entry into the revolution. He was involved in almost all the major operations in the first 3 years of the war. So if you just follow Arnold's career through those early and crucial years, you get a kind of a logic of how the Revolutionary War unfolded. The war began on the morning of April 19th, 1775, when the British shot and killed 8 Minutemen at Lexington Green. The enraged patriots came back and killed more than 70 of the king's soldiers, and the war was on. And the day after the news of Lexington arrived at New Haven, on April 22nd, Benedict Arnold marched off to war. He had organized a militia company, not very experienced, but a group of men. He recruited some Yale students to join them. He had a little dispute with the town fathers, who they just wanted to wait a while to see what developed. This was a brand new development in the colonies, and it was up in Massachusetts, and they didn't know if they should be sending a military force off to fight the king's soldiers. And Arnold said that either he was going to get he wanted to get the keys to the town magazine or powder house so that he could get muskets and gunpowder for his troops. And he said if they didn't get the keys, they were going to break it open. So General David Wooster, who was the head of militia in Connecticut, reluctantly handed over the keys. They took the guns and gunpowder and marched up to where the Patriots were besieging the British in Boston. And that happens to be an event that's reenacted every year on what's called Powder House Day in New Haven. 3 weeks after the war began, 3 weeks after Lexington, on May 10th, Benedict Arnold took over captured the most strategic fortification in the 13 colonies at Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain in Upper New York. And he not only captured the fort, but he, on his own initiative, without orders from anybody, sailed up to Canada and captured a British warship that was the only warship they had on Lake Champlain. And by doing that, gained control of Lake Champlain for the Patriots. The question that arises is, was that a great achievement? Was that a very significant achievement? I think it was, because the British strategy the first 2 years of the war was to capture a water column that went down from Montreal, down Lake Champlain, Lake George, with a portage over to the Hudson River, and then all the way down the Hudson River to New York. This was kind of the superhighway of that day, and the British thought it was crucial to control that corridor. They would be able to split off New England, divide the colonies, and win the war. So that was their objective, and the obstacle to it was Fort Ticonderoga was right in the middle, and the control that the Patriots now had of Lake Champlain. In addition to that, there were an excess of cannon at Fort Ticonderoga, which the Patriots very famously that the following winter put on sleds and dragged across the entire state of Massachusetts. And that allowed George Washington to achieve his first victory by driving the British out of Boston in March of 1776. So between those two things, it seems like Benedict Arnold had pulled off one of the great achievements of the war in many ways. But if we look in the history books, it's really not much more than a footnote. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga is not given a lot of credit. The credit is often given to Ethan Allen, and it's true that Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys did provide the manpower. The Green Mountain Boys were a vigilante group that Allen had gotten up before the war, and really with nothing to do with the dispute with England, but they provided the manpower. But after the excitement was over, the Green Mountain Boys went home. Ethan Allen's performance was less than stellar in the Revolutionary War in general. And really the leadership, the idea of taking over Ticonderoga, the leadership, and particularly that initiative to take over and gain control of Lake Champlain was all Benedict Arnold. So that brings up the question then, do we owe it to Benedict Arnold to get the history right? And I don't think we do. I think that Benedict Arnold was certainly a traitor. There's nothing in my book that in any way exonerates him for his treason. And in fact, I think the severity of his treason was worse than many people think. So we don't owe him anything, but we owe it to ourselves to straighten out the discrepancies in history. And the problem is that Benedict Arnold is a paradox. He was a hero and he was a villain. He was somebody who was devoted to the cause and to the revolution, and somebody who tried to destroy the revolution. And the tendency is nobody likes a paradox is sort of hard to get your mind around. And so over the years, there have been attempts to erase the paradox by simply saying he was never a hero. He was only a villain. And his accomplishments were insignificant, or his participation in them was minimal, or his motives were suspect. In some of the early biographies, they even said he was a nasty little boy, and therefore he must have been a traitor from the cradle. These stories have really distorted the history of the war, and it's a type of history that I call the Parson Weems history, where everything is very simple. George Washington could do no evil, Benedict Arnold could do no good. What I would refer to as history for adults includes all the paradoxes and the conflicts and the changes of heart and the wavering, which we see, and I think it's one reason it's important to look closely at Benedict Arnold. We see it in many characters. And just in the Revolutionary War, there's people like Aaron Burr or Ethan Allen himself or General Charles Lee or even Horatio Gates. They did not go as far as Benedict Arnold, but they wavered. They had conflicting views. They had some self-interest. Even somebody like John Brown later on in our history, was he a good person or was he a bad person? He tried to free slaves, but he resorted to violence. So that's the complex history that I think, and I think it's a much more interesting type of history. So we jump ahead to 1776, and the value of having captured Ticonderoga is now illustrated because the British want to come down and invade that invasion of that water corridor that I spoke of earlier. This is one of the gunboats that was on Lake Champlain that the Patriots had. This is a replica, was built by the Lake Champlain. British plan to come down Lake Champlain was thwarted by the fact that if they moved their army on troop transports down the lake to fight at Ticonderoga, they would have been vulnerable to these American ships that had 3 cannon on it, and a pretty large cannon. So they had to build their own fleet of warships to protect their troop transports, and they were doing that up in St. John's. And during the summer of 1776, there was kind of an arms race going on with the British building ships up here, and Benedict Arnold, in charge of the nautical defense of Fort Ticonderoga, was down in Skenesboro, which is now Whitehall, building more warships, preparing. In August, he went up to the north end of Lake Champlain to wait for the British with a small fleet. The British wanted to have overwhelming firepower, so they kept building more and more ships. Finally, Arnold pulled back to Valcour Island to protect his fleet from the storms that come up there in the fall, and he put his fleet in a small bay between Valcour Island and the mainland. This is a contemporary map of that area. And when he heard the British were coming down, his second in command said, we got to get out of here. Let's make a run for it. And Arnold said, no, we're going to stay here. We're going to fight the British, the Royal Navy, and we're going to beat them. And he was very confident, always had a plan of exactly what he was going to do. This was a blind bay. There was a shallow water up here, so you had to come in through the south. He put this is the American boats anchored, so they didn't have to sail and shoot at the same time. The British had trouble getting these larger ships that they'd constructed up into the bay because the wind was from the north. And this represents the British gunboats, which were rowed boats with heavy cannon on them. And they were able to get up in there and fire. And there was a very brutal battle went on for 7 hours. The British and the Americans firing back and forth, point blank cannon range, a lot of casualties. And then it got dark and the Americans were still standing. The British had not been able to break that line. But the Patriots had expended 3/4 of their ammunition. They had taken a lot of damage to their boats. So now what? And Benedict Arnold said, I have a plan. We're going to escape. The British had created a blockade across the mouth of the bay. And the way that the Patriots were able to get out of there was almost like a fairy tale. But Arnold was able to guide them through very quietly in the dark and the night. They got farther down the lake. There was more fighting. The American fleet was largely destroyed. But the outcome was that by the time the British did get their army down to Fort Ticonderoga, it was too late in the season, and they decided that they were afraid the lake was going to freeze behind them, and then they would be trapped down there. And they decided it would be better to go back to Montreal and return in the spring. So that the Northern Campaign in 1776 was a complete success in the sense that it stopped the British invasion. Was it an important event? Well, all you have to do is look at the other end of that water corridor. This is sort of a complicated map, but it shows what was happening in New York. George Washington lost the biggest battle of the entire war in the Battle of Brooklyn in August. He was forced out of New York City, eventually forced across the Hudson River, and then pushed all the way back across New Jersey until he was in Pennsylvania. And his 20,000-man army by December had shrunk to 3,000 men. And he wrote a letter to his brother, and he said, I think the game is pretty near up. If he had had to contend with an invasion coming down from Lake Champlain and then down the river from the north, I think it would have been curtains for the Patriots. But instead, Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, who was the commander at Ticonderoga, brought more than 600 men, now no longer needed at Ticonderoga because the British had gone home, on ships, and then marched down to join Washington's army in Pennsylvania. And some of the men who fought at Valcour Island also crossed the Delaware on Christmas night and fought in the famous battle, and Washington's greatest victory in defeating the Hessians at Trenton. Benedict Arnold was not one of them because he had been sent off on another assignment, but he had made it possible for these men to join Washington and increase his force to go over across the Delaware. This was quite an enormous achievement that Arnold had pulled off in 1776. And what do they say in the history books? Well, I can't say it, just a footnote, because there was a book that came out a couple of years ago called Valcour, the 1776 Campaign that Saved the Cause of Liberty, that I wrote myself. But when I was researching that book, I was really struck by how little had been written about the Northern Campaign, and many books history books just don't even mention it. Why? Because it was Benedict Arnold, and they wanted to downplay Benedict Arnold's achievements. We now jump to 1777, and this is getting a little closer to home for folks in New Haven. This was Arnold's house on Water Street. He had at least one of the largest houses in town, and quite an elegant house. And he had come back there in April of 1777 on leave. He finally, after spending a lot of time out campaigning in the field, he had taken a break from the war. And while he was there, the news arrived that Connecticut had been invaded. And the British had landed at Campo Beach, and that was then Norwalk, but is now Westport. And nobody knew exactly what they were going to do. Arnold teamed up with David Wooster, who is now the general in command of all Connecticut militia, the man he'd had the dispute with at the Powder House. And the two of them rode from New Haven down to Fairfield. There they found out that the British had gone inland to attack Danbury. It's about 25 miles inland. The Patriots thought that by putting a supply depot there, and that was one of their major supply depots, it would be safe from these raids that the British would launch from ships on the Long Island Sound. But it turned out they sent a 1,500-man army, landed them on the beach, and they marched in there and were in the process of destroying all the very valuable supplies at Danbury. Wooster and Benedict Arnold rode into as far as Reading and found out what was happening. They didn't have enough men to confront the British. These are crack British troops. So they made a plan. And from Reading, Arnold was going to take the main force over to Ridgefield, and Wooster was going to continue up to Danbury and just sort of follow along behind the British and harass them from behind while the British had decided to march on a western route down, not the way they came, because they knew that the militia were gathering over in the east. So that's what they did. Arnold set up a barricade across the road, the main road through Ridgefield, and waited for the British to come. This was really a pickup force of militia. Some of them were Ridgefield militia, which had only organized a few days earlier. They had not even had a chance for a drill. And I like in these battles to try to get across a sense of the reality of it. This was not a costume drama, and these guys were standing there with muskets, waiting for this large force of British soldiers, very well organized, very experienced soldiers, to come down. And you can imagine on a nice April morning, in the distance, first they hear musket fire, and that was General Wooster attacking the British rear. Then there's more silence, then more musket fire, and the very ominous sound of cannon. And the British had moved some cannon back to protect their rear. And in that fight, David Wooster, who was 66 years old, by the way, he was not a young man to begin with, really quite admirable. He was still out in the field, and he was mortally wounded. So the British continued on and then unlimbered their cannon in the face of these men standing behind the barricade. And the shooting started and went back and forth, and the Patriots gave as good as they got. Benedict Arnold was on a horse, I guess is represented here by this artist's depiction, steadying the troops, giving orders. And they eventually had to pull back. The British had the numbers and just started going around both flanks, so they pulled back. Arnold's horse was shot out from under him. The story goes that while he was trying to extricate himself from the saddle, a British soldier came up and pointed a musket at him and said, "You're my prisoner." And Arnold pulled out a pistol and said, "Not yet," and shot him dead. So that's the Patriots then pulled back. This is famous cannonball landed at the Keeler Tavern in the corner post of the Keeler Tavern in Ridgefield, and it's still there today. That tavern's now become a museum there. The British spent the night in Ridgefield, and then there was more fighting down around the bridge that they had to cross over the creek to get to their ships. Arnold inflicted quite a few casualties on the British, and enough to make them think twice about ever doing that again, that type of raid to disrupt the Patriot supplies. At the time, that was considered a very important battle, a very important lesson the British learned, that they weren't going to just passively allow them to come in and march where they wanted to. John Adams said that Benedict Arnold should have gotten a gold medal for it. The Congress should give him a gold medal. They never did, but it was taken very seriously. But today, it's hard to find a reference to the Battle of Ridgefield in many histories of the war. So, and of course, the reason for that being that it was to diminish the reputation of Benedict Arnold. So the next thing that happened in July of 1777 was that the British did finally launched that invasion. General John Burgoyne, his 7,000-man army, came down Lake Champlain easily. There was no more American fleet to stop them, easily took Fort Ticonderoga, and was on the march towards Albany. Benedict Arnold rode up there, joined Horatio Gates, who was in command. They decided together to meet Burgoyne at the high ground a few miles south of the village of Saratoga. They fought two battles there, collectively known as the Battle of Saratoga. And both battles, Burgoyne tried to sweep around the left side of the American lines. And in both battles, Benedict Arnold was in command of the left division. In the first battle, he stopped Burgoyne cold, inflicted heavy casualties. And in the second battle, he decisively defeated Burgoyne and then led a charge that broke through the British field fortifications. And by doing that, put Burgoyne in a position where he had to do what he said he would never do, which was to retreat. Benedict Arnold was severely wounded in that with a bullet through his leg, and that breaking into the British field fortifications. But General Burgoyne, 10 days later, had to surrender his entire army. The turning point of the Revolutionary War, Time magazine said that it was the single most important battle fought anywhere in the world in the last 1,000 years. So it sounds pretty important. But many of the stories about Saratoga will downplay the role of Benedict Arnold and say that some of them would even say he was drunk during the battle. He relieved his command. He was sulking in his cabin. Historians today are coming around, though, to the conclusion, I think, that Benedict Arnold really was the essential man in the essential battle of the Revolutionary War. 3 years later, in 1780, we come to the one thing that everybody knows about Benedict Arnold is he went over to the British, and this was an effigy that was pulled through Philadelphia after his treason was discovered. And of course, the big question is, why did he do it? Many historians have come up with many reasons, and a lot of historians have their favorite theories. Some say it was for the money. The British did pay him a considerable amount of money. Some said he was that it was his wife. He'd married Peggy Shippen, who was a young loyalist, leaning young lady from Philadelphia, and she influenced him in his decision. Some say it was because he was fed up with Congress and the fact that he had not gotten the promotions that he deserved. I discuss these factors in the book, and I add, to speculate a little bit myself, but my real answer to that question of why Arnold changed sides is I don't know. I think he was a very enigmatic character, very hard to figure out. And I sometimes wonder if he even knew himself, if he could have articulated why he did it, but he did it. And because he never did anything by halves, he got command of the lower Hudson Valley. Because of his wound, he couldn't go back into a field command. And he was supervising the lower Hudson Valley, which included West Point, which is up here. It was not a military academy then. It was a major fort protecting the Hudson River. And he decided to allow the British to take it over as he plotted with the British. He had a meeting in Haverstraw in September of 1780 with the head of British intelligence, and he gave this, that was Major John Andre. He gave Andre a map of the fort to show him how it could be taken over, other documents, And then Arnold went back to his headquarters, which was opposite West Point, and Major John Andre started down the Hudson River, riding down the east side of the Hudson River on horseback in civilian clothes to take all this information back to the British. He got down as far as Tarrytown. He was very excited and very nervous because he'd pulled off the biggest intelligence coup of the war that was really going to make his career. And he was nervous because this area of Westchester County was no man's land. It was above the British lines and below the American lines. So it was patrolled by both Patriot and Loyalist militia units. Sure enough, some men jumped out of the bushes and stopped Andre. And Andre made the mistake of saying, "I hope you're of our party." And one of the militiamen said, "Oh yeah, what party is that?" And so now Andre had to guess. He guessed wrong. He said the lower party, meaning the British. And the man said, "We're Americans, get down." They captured him. They found the documents, searched him, offered them bribes, which they refused. And they took him to their commanding officer, which was a Colonel Jameson. Now, Colonel Jameson was a little slow in the uptake, I think, because the first thing he did was to send a letter by courier to his commanding officer, who was Benedict Arnold. And then he had second thoughts about it because he's going like, well, these documents are in Benedict Arnold's handwriting. Well, what is going on? So he decided to send it all up to George Washington, which brings in the next plot twist, was because George Washington was not in the American camp over on the New Jersey border, but had gone out to Hartford to meet French officers, was on his way back to camp, and was on his way, was going to stop and have breakfast with Benedict Arnold. And then they were going to inspect West Point together. So you have two couriers separately heading towards Arnold's headquarters, because the second courier found out that's where he could find Washington. Washington coming down the river from the north. And some of it, Washington's aides actually arrived there. They said, "The general's just up the road, get ready, he'll be here in a minute." Then the first courier arrived, and he handed a letter to Benedict Arnold. Arnold read it. He told his wife, "I got to go." He said to everybody else, "I'm going over to West Point, tell Washington to wait." Washington arrived. Arnold wasn't there. He's over in West Point. Okay. Washington said, we'll go over and do the inspection now. So his entire entourage over to West Point. They arrived there. Nobody had seen Arnold for 2 days. And George Washington later described his own thinking. He said, "My mind misgave me, but I had not the least idea of the real cause." And we know that feeling, there's something very wrong here. And he started inspecting the fort, and he saw the fort was not in very good shape. There was not enough men there, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. It was what was going on. And being the unflappable George Washington, he went back to Arnold's headquarters, decided to take a nap. And before he was able to lie down in bed, the second courier arrived, gave him the letter and the documents that Colonel Jameson had sent up to him. He immediately saw what was going on. He called in Henry Knox, his most trusted subordinate, and he said, "Arnold has betrayed us. Who can we trust now?" And it was not a rhetorical question, because at that point, Washington didn't know who was involved or how far this plot went. And he sent Alexander Hamilton tearing down the Hudson River on horseback to try to catch up with Arnold. He sent a message to the army to get as many troops as they could up to West Point. And then the real drama began. And Arnold's wife, Peggy, former Peggy Shippen, this is, interestingly, this is a drawing that was made of her by Major Andre when the British controlled Philadelphia and she was flirting with the British troops. she started tearing her clothes off and screaming and yelling that she had to see Washington, and she was having an hysterical fit, they thought, because of her husband's treason. And they couldn't imagine that she was actually had been in on the plot all along, and that she was trying to help her husband escape, which he did. And he escaped down the river, got to a British ship, went down to New York, joined the British Army, and fought for about a year. He went down to Virginia, fought then, and then came to his final visit to Connecticut in September of 1781. He was sent up to raid New London, and he went up there on ships with a force of redcoats and burnt most of the town and sent a contingent over to Fort Griswold, which is, I'm skipping ahead here. Let's see. This is an image of Fort Griswold as is today. And there was actually then a massacre by British troops of the militia that were defending Fort Griswold. And that was this sort of bitter goodbye to America from Benedict Arnold, and he then sailed to England and never set foot in America again. General, this is a drawing that Major Andre made of himself while he was waiting for his trial. About 10 days after the plot was uncovered, he was hanged as a spy. The men who captured Andre were given these silver medals with the word fidelity, sort of a contrast to Benedict Arnold. These were the first military decorations ever handed out in American history. And those three men were quite famous for a while. So we see Fort Griswold again. And one of Arnold's aides, not too long after the treason was uncovered, said, wouldn't it have been better if the bullet that had gone through Arnold's leg had gone through his heart? And that's really a sentiment that's been picked up by historians down the years, that if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would have been one of the greatest military heroes in our history. So I think it just sort of puts an underline under the fact that Benedict Arnold's very paradoxical career ended the way that it did. But he lived over in England until 1781. He died when he was 60 years old. So that's the end of my presentation, and I welcome any questions you might have or issues you think we can discuss. I'll turn it back over. Let's see.
All right, Jack, thank you so much. I actually do have a question that is in the chat. Would you agree that Arnold has been considered to be the best general on both sides?
That would be a difficult judgment to make. I can't say that he was the best. Different people had different. I'm trying to get out of my slideshow, so I'm okay. There we go. I'm stopping. Different officers had different skills. Certainly, Benedict Arnold had a incredible tactical and strategic skills. It's hard to think of an officer that really towered above him, but he lacked a certain diplomacy. He lacked an ability to get along with people. And I think certainly George Washington ended up as a better general than he was, and probably Nathaniel Greene as well. Some of the other generals, it took them a while, but they got up to speed. Anthony Wayne, Daniel Morgan. So I wouldn't want to make that judgment, but certainly Arnold was among the best.
All right, now some more other questions are coming in. Did Arnold ever write his own bio later in life?
No, in fact, Arnold hardly ever wrote anything. He was not an intellectual in any sense, and he was not an introspective person. He wasn't somebody that thought, looked at his thoughts or imagined what his motives were. He was really a man of action all his life. Even after he was over in England, he tried to get back into the military because that's what he really loved, was the fighting, the being in the action. So he never took time to write. It would have been an interesting book, I'll say that, but
It would have.
he never did it.
Have they found a tunnel under Arnold's house in New Haven?
Not that I know of, but it's possible.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard that either.
The house is no longer there. There's pictures of it going well into the 19th century, but it became I think it was turned into a barn actually, which was sort of a come down. But
okay. What was Arnold's life in England like? I have read that the English didn't like him because he was a traitor.
yeah, that was the general feeling. There were some people that did get along with him, but many people, even of the British, even though he had come over to their side, they just didn't like a traitor. And you have to remember too that he had killed a lot of British soldiers. I mean, he was responsible for the death of a lot of British soldiers. So particularly the British officers hated him and blocked any attempt that he made to get back into being active service in the British Army, which is what he wanted to do.
Okay, I've moved over to the Q&A now. Who was Arnold's second in command at West Point? Was anyone else worried about the fortifications before Washington arrived?
There was Colonel Lamb was really what I guess you would call the second in command. And that's a good question. He had to explain to Washington why the things were the way they were. And I think he may have suspected, but no, the trouble was that nobody really suspected. And John Lamb was a experienced artillery officer. So he would have probably seen something, but and no one, it would just seem beyond imagination that Arnold could be plotting anything like that.
All right, back to the chat. And I think you already answered this. Is Arnold's house still standing in New Haven? And then I have what became of his wife. And then somebody else wanted to know what happened to his wife. And actually, I do too.
Yeah, Peggy Shippen was his second wife, and she stayed loyal to him in a very difficult situation. Followed him to England. They had 5 children over there, and she stuck with him. They lived for a few years in Canada. All his children went in. All of the boys in his family went into the British military. She received a stipend from the British government for her part in the plot because she had acted as a go-between between him and Major Andre. And she was quite a bit younger than him, but she only survived him by a couple of years, and then she died of cancer.
Oh, okay.
She came and she did come back briefly to visit her family. He never came back. Of course, he couldn't because he would have been hanged.
I've heard it said that Arnold was a rare military leader who was effective on both land and water. Any others come to mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. Usually the Navy men are strictly Navy, and I suppose some Marine officers would fall into that category. But Arnold was always in the Army. The whole operation on Lake Champlain, though was a naval operation, so to speak, was manned and directed by the Army. So though he used his nautical skills and did have those skills. And one of the questions I often get is, why was Benedict Arnold such a good officer when he had no military experience or training? And I always point to the fact that he had been a ship's captain before the war, and the sense of command and the attention to detail, the really strategic thinking that a sea captain needs, and particularly in those days, were transferable over to his military career.
Okay, and that was actually, somebody asked the question, where did he get his military training? So thank you for answering that. Another one, is there any speculation that people working with Arnold at West Point were aware of the conspiracy?
I've never come across evidence of that. No,
Okay.
because he was really in a life or death situation. He'd negotiated for months with the British, and if any word had gotten out that he was plotting to go over to the British, I mean, that would have been a death penalty for him. So he was pretty careful about it.
All right, we're going to take a couple more back to the chat. How much did Arnold's leg injury hold him back? Do you think he would have achieved more rank without it?
He had already gotten up to be a major general, and they gave him all the promotion that he deserved by that time. He was laid up and in great pain. It was a type of wound that usually they would have amputated the leg, and he didn't allow them to amputate it, and it was very painful, very disabling for maybe 6 months or more. He then did come back to the Army, but he said he just didn't feel he could be in command, in a field command anymore. How much of that was dissembling because he wanted to get this command of West Point? By that point, he had decided to switch sides, because as soon as he joined the British, he did go into a field command. So that's all a little hard to figure, and I think, but there's no question that he was probably in pain for all of his life afterwards. The medical treatment in those days was pretty primitive.
Not great. Okay, two more. Did Peggy go to England with Arnold?
Yes, they didn't go on the same ship, but she did go over, and George Washington was very kind to her, really. At first, they weren't sure whether she had been involved in the plot, but even when it did become fairly clear that she was, they didn't try to punish her in any way, and just allowed her to do what she wanted to follow her husband.
Okay. And let's see. I suspect that Benedict Arnold was conflicted in his decision to become a traitor. He was a very capable leader in armed conflict. Unfortunate. Oops. Hold on. Unfortunate. Oh, I lost it. Unfortunate that he couldn't see the future in terms of the American Revolution. I read an historic novel about him and his wife's involvement in the war, but I believe it was a difficult time to determine which road to take. And he did get a bad rap overall. Do you have anything you want to say to that?
Yeah, that's a good point in a way that I sometimes think of Benedict Arnold. One of the interesting aspects of him is that he did reflect his time. We tend to think of him as a uniquely bad, traitorous individual, but the country was very divided then, and the conflict between the patriots on the one hand, the loyalists on the other hand, and the people that were just on the fence, was all of that sort of reflected in Benedict Arnold's person. That he and I would point out that he never really thought he committed treason. He thought that he had done the right thing by rebelling against the king, and that now he was doing the right thing by trying to end the war and this terrible war that had gone on for about 6 years now by helping the British get a victory, and that he felt that they achieved everything that they could achieve, and they should get so he didn't say, well, I'm going to commit treason. He said, I'm going to do what I now think is the right thing to do, and that's what he did.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and one more. Were his efforts as a British member significant in the New York battles?
You mean when he was a British officer?
It says were his efforts as a British member significant
he was
in the New
he
York
was
battles?
quite effective. He was quite effective in fighting in Virginia and leading British troops against American troops. One of the things that I think to me is the worst of the black marks against him. He could have said, well, I don't believe in the cause anymore. I'm going to resign my commission and go home. And there were numerous officers who did that. The officer could resign at any point. He could have done that, but instead he went over and then led British troops to kill Americans who had been his troops and his subordinates. And that was really morally was the thing that really made him a really bad traitor. And the raid on New London just sort of rubbed it in. And it was almost like an Oedipal complex, I think, they went up there, almost his hometown. He was from Norwich. He was born in Norwich, just up the river from New London. And so he sort of went back to his own nest and fouled it as his last act. And that was actually the last big operation in the north of the entire war.
All right. Well, Jack, can you tell everyone now where they can buy the book? Because that may answer some of the other questions that we may not get to.
Yeah, you can contact me, find places to buy the book, such as Amazon and other online retailers. You can order a signed copy, all from my website, which is jackkellybooks.com. And I have a contact page on there. If you have questions, I'm always happy to look them over. And I also have a Substack newsletter to keep up on what I'm doing. Just sign up for a subscription. That's also on the website.
All right. Well, first, thank you, Jack, for being here tonight and for such a great presentation. And thank you all for tuning in tonight. For more information on the 250th in Connecticut, please visit ct250.org. And for more information about the museum, please visit newhavenmuseum.org. And we thank you again for being here tonight. And I hope everybody has a great evening.